Hey guys, it's Krista Watson here from Krista Quilts, and I'm back with another fun tutorial showing how I machine bind my quilts. I'm going to show it to you two different ways on two different fun quilts. We'll start off with this color weave quilt behind me, and then I'll show you how I did the machine binding on my infrastructure quilt. So let's dive in and take a look. So the first thing we need to do before we apply our binding is we need to trim off the excess batting and backing. This is also known as squaring up the quilt so we can put the binding on with a nice tight seam. A large acrylic square ruler makes this easy to do. First, I line up the ruler along the corner edge of the quilt and trim on both sides of the square. I'll repeat this on all four corners of the quilt to ensure that the quilt stays nice and square. Then I'll move on to the sides. Next, I'll use a long ruler to trim up the sides the same way. I place the ruler next to one of the previously trimmed corners so I have a straight edge to follow. I'm also using the seam lines as a guideline to keep things nice and straight. You can always nudge the seams into place if needed. Once the quilt is all trimmed up, it's ready to bind. I like to make a continuous binding cut out from regular straight of grain strips. These are how we're used to cutting, and it makes it a lot easier to figure out how much binding you need to do. So first of all, we're going to need a number. We need to know the perimeter of the quilt, and then I like to add about 5 or 10 inches onto that. That's going to tell me the total amount of binding that I need to cut. So let's say, for example, our total perimeter plus a little extra is 320 inches, and we're going to use 40-inch wide fabric. You would take 320 divided by 40, and that's going to give you 8. 8 strips is how much you would need to cut. I like to cut my binding strips 2 inches wide because then it'll finish evenly on the front and back with a nice narrow binding. If you want to make your binding strips wider, that's completely up to you. I want my binding strips to have mitered seams, which means sewing them on the diagonal. This will reduce the bulk of the fabric once the binding has been attached to the quilt. The easiest way to do this is to place one strip right side up, then add the next strip right side down at a 90-degree angle. Sew from corner to corner to make that diagonal seam. You can mark the sewing line if you need to, but I just eyeball it because that's fast and easy. Don't worry if it looks messy now with the selvages still attached. All of that extra fabric will get trimmed away in just a moment. Keep going by adding the next strip at the end of the previous one. You can chain piece, which means sewing the strips together without cutting your threads in between. Sewing mitered seams like this will reduce the bulk when you are attaching the binding to the quilt. Once the strips are sewn, press the seams open, trim off the excess fabric with 1/4 inch seams, and then trim one edge of the binding at a 45-degree angle. This will be your starting end. Finally, fold the continuous strip wrong sides together and press it along the length with a hot, dry iron. Now you're ready to attach the binding to the quilt. Whenever I bind my machines, it's a little bit different than how I attach the binding when I'm hand sewing. For example, if I'm hand sewing, I'm going to sew the binding strips onto the front of the quilt, wrap it around to the back, and secure it. When I'm machine binding, I do it the opposite way. I actually sew the binding strips to the back of the quilt and then wrap them around to the front. This does two things. First of all, it gives me a nice even edge to follow when I'm stitching, and second of all, it allows the decorative stitching to become part of the design of the quilt. It may not line up perfectly on the back, but I'm okay with that. You can use a matching thread or a decorative thread depending on the look you're going for. Start on the side, away from the corner, and leave a few inches of starting tail. You'll need the extra to join up later. I'm sewing with a 1/4 inch seam using the dual feed mechanism with my sewing machine. You can also use a walking foot for this step. When you get to the corner, make a crease that matches up with the edge of the quilt and stop stitching a 1/4 inch in front of that. Then stitch off the corner to secure. Take the quilt off the machine and do what I call the funky fold. Fold the strip up so that it's in line with the edge of the quilt. Then fold it back down on itself to create the corner miter. The top edge of the fold should line up exactly with the top of the quilt. Hold on to the thread ends to help pull the binding through the corner. It's a bit thick here, so that really helps. Continue stitching the binding down on the side of the quilt until you get to the corner and repeat the process. When you get to the end of the quilt, leave several inches of ending tail so that both the starting and ending strip will overlap. Open up the ending tail and place the starting tail inside of it. Open up the cut angled end and mark a line right next to it on the uncut binding tail. Use a water-soluble pen or disappearing marker. Then add 1/2 inch to this marked line for seam allowances on both pieces of fabric and trim at a 45-degree angle. Match up the angled ends and offset the little triangles about 1/4 inch on both sides. Then pin and sew the seam together to create the continuous binding strip. Trim off those angle tips and finger press the seam open to reduce the bulk. Fold the strip back wrong sides together and finish sewing the binding to the quilt. Pinning will really help keep everything nice and flat and even. Now you're ready to flip over the binding to the front of the quilt and finish stitching it down by machine. I like to use wonder clips to hold the binding in place while I stitch. To miter the corners, flip the corner over to the front. Then fold down one side of the corner and then the other one. Try to fold them so that the bulk is on the opposite sides at the corner. It will naturally fold at an angled seam when you do this. Use a stiletto to hold down the binding while you stitch. For my color weave quilt, I'm stitching 2 rows of straight stitching to mimic the straight stitch quilting design on the quilt. First, I stitch right next to the edge of the binding to hold it in place. When you get to the corners, stop with the needle in the down position. Then pivot the quilt to keep stitching. Be sure to catch both layers of binding before turning to make sure it's securely attached. Continue stitching all sides of the quilt this way until you reach your starting point and secure the stitches by stitching on top of the previous line of stitching with more teeny tiny stitches. Or make a knot with the top and bottom threads and hide that in the batting. Add a second row of stitching about 1/4 inch away from the first row. This will be very close to the edge of the quilt. This is purely decorative, but it does add another secure layer of stitching to the quilt so it can't hurt. Now that you've seen how I added the binding to my color weave quilt, let me show you how I did a similar idea on my infrastructure quilt with a little bit of a different stitch pattern. This time I'm going to use a decorative stitch on my sewing machine to finish up the binding. I'll follow the same procedure to square up the edges and cut my binding strips, then trim one end at a 45-degree angle and press the wrong sides together. Now it's time to sew the binding to the back of the quilt. Remember to leave a few inches of starting tail and start sewing on any side. You can walk your binding around the perimeter of the quilt to ensure that none of the joining seams will end up in the corner. However, if that does happen, you can always trim off 1 inch or 2 of binding at that point and re-sew. This will move your seam away from the corner. Don't forget that funky fold. After doing a few quilts this way, it will become like second nature in no time. Join the binding tails just like before. Make sure there's enough overlap and mark where the 2 ends meet. You are adding 1/2 inch to one end to allow for 1/4 inch seams on both sides of the binding. Trim off those dog ears, press the seam open, and finish stitching it down to create a continuous loop. Use a stiletto to keep the binding in place and stitch the width of the binding all the way around the quilt. You can use any stitch you like, but some fun ones are the serpentine stitch or running zigzag. Test a few out on a practice scrap and then adjust your stitch length and width to see what you personally like. I matched the same decorative stitch design that I used for the machine quilting. Fold the corners down and catch them in the stitch pattern. Here's another corner so you can see what that looks like again. When you get back to your starting spot, you can stitch on top of the previous stitching. Because the fabric and thread are dark, you can't really see the start and stop here. But if it's more noticeable, I'd try to line up the pattern or switch to a straight stitch at the end and then just lock the threads into place. Well, there you have it, 2 easy ways to finish your quilts with machine binding. If you try either one of these methods, please let me know by leaving a comment. I sure hope you enjoyed it. See you next time.